Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast on the Post-Gazette Sports Now YouTube channel by Seth Engle of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. Seth, it's our first official postseason podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah. So it was, had a fun little break at home and, I got to go to Atlanta for a week as we talked about last time, and went to the Palestra this past weekend for some Penn State basketball, which was just historic. It's a museum there, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit about that game later on. But doing well back in State College, and off season is on its way after last night's championship.
Yeah, we're going to dig into that. Penn State watches Michigan win the national championship, beating Washington pretty soundly in Houston. And that's kind of the topic for the show. How did we get here? How did we get to Michigan national champions in 2020? It was a rough year for Penn State. They had a losing record for the first time in many years. Don't go to a bowl game, pandemic affected, but they could hang their hat that year on they beat Michigan in the Big House. They get that big win, kind of get some of the good vibes rolling again. And at that point, they had won 3 out of 4 games against Michigan. You think back to 2019 and what was it? They had to call timeout on the first play of the game in the whiteout. Michigan did. It was embarrassing. It was something Penn State has still to this day dunks on Michigan for. That was the landscape we were in 3 years ago. Penn State had pretty well, I think, passed Michigan as a program, and now Michigan is hoisting the college football playoff championship trophy. Seth, what happened between that moment and last night?
Well, I think that Michigan, you have to look at the way that team is built. And I think it's built the right way. If you're starting a team, you want to start in the trenches. Offensive and defensive lines are going to be your team's anchors to success. And basically those other pieces around, the trenches, they're going to have to, develop and maybe figure themselves out over time. Michigan was a team that always had a good offensive line and always had a good defensive line. Dating back to the early years with Harbaugh. What the question was, really that offensive consistency to back it up, and the pieces just came together. JJ McCarthy came in, and, I know he's not, some spectacular quarterback. He's great. And I think he does have a future in the NFL. He's not, Michael Penix or Caleb Williams, but he's good. And he was the right fit for that system. And then you have guys like Wilson and Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards, and it just worked out. And that defense stayed consistent. The offensive line stayed consistent, and the pieces came together at the right time, and they found success. That's basically what happened. Over the past 2 years was they stuck to the script and they found a roster that they felt they could win with, and they stuck with that for the past 2 seasons.
One thing Bill DiFilippo, a friend of mine who hosts the Roar Lions Roar podcast, observed last night on Twitter was that that Michigan has a lot of 3+ year guys, veteran guys, program guys, as you might call them. Maybe they're not the best NFL prospects, but they've stayed around in the system for a long time, and that's built a lot of the depth that Michigan was able to lean on their run to a national championship. I find that somewhat in contrast with Penn State, where I think the culture is a little more geared toward go to the pros, when you're ready. And there's been, I think a lot of fans encourage that. There's certainly people who say, man, I wish that player would stay and then get upset. But I think Penn State's culture is very much turned toward that's a selling point, is that you come to Penn State, you will be an NFL prospect if you put the work in and you do a good job. And I feel like the loyalty to the program is maybe is not on the same level as what they have kind of cultivated at Michigan. And that's why Michigan has a lot more of these program guys who've developed and were able to make impacts in the national championship game. Do you think that is, if the goal for Penn State is to win a national championship, that kind of culture that they've kind of cultivated works against them a little bit? I don't want to say it's a bad thing because, I think the goal for a lot of these guys is to get to the NFL, to make money, to change their families' lives. And, I don't think there's a lot of shame in Penn State being a program that helps, be a pipeline for those guys. But the other side is it definitely makes winning a national championship a little bit harder, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, Michigan's also just gotten so much closer than Penn State. So when you kind of have that taste of, the playoffs, or, that taste of, okay, we're a game away from the national championship kind of in your mouth, it helps. And it helps keep people around. Like, you look at Blake Corum returning, which I feel like is the ultimate example of, like, why would this guy return? He's going to be one of the top running backs in the draft last year. Why would he come back? Well, he came back because he knew Michigan, had the opportunity to win a national championship, which is exactly what they did. Which, kept, a ton of these, kind of veteran guys around. Like, I think Zach Zinter is a good example too, of a guy who's been good for a long time and, risked injury and did get hurt, in that Ohio State game, but was just such a solid player for such a long time. I think Penn State has that in a way, but I just don't think that the product has been, the same as what Michigan's able to do. Like, Penn State had that with the Rose Bowl a little bit, where we saw, there was some excitement and guys were a little amped up. But when you're not making the playoff, it's like, it kind of lacks your motivation in a way. And I just think Michigan has been so close for the past 3 years, so it's really kept that core together.
Yeah, I should say I think Penn State has done a good job on the portal end of things, of recruiting your guys to stay and keeping them in the fold. So in that way, I think they have mimicked Michigan pretty well. I think it's the top end talent, and you mentioned Blake Corum. I think the only guy you can really put in that category for Penn State in recent vintage is Olu Fashanu, right? He was the one guy that kind of surprised you, and you said, "Wow, I thought he was going pro, but he's going to stay at Penn State for another season." I guess you can put Tyler Warren in that category this year a little bit, but I don't know if it's to the same degree. I mean, Olu was a first-round pick last year and decides to come back. So, give James Franklin credit for succeeding at keeping his guys here rather than heading to other programs, having them bought in on that vision. I just wonder how much, how much is this taking the next step for Penn State? It's going to be about convincing those really good players to stay, and what role is NIL going to play in that? I don't know a ton about Michigan's NIL program and how that, factored in to things, but we know Penn State had been lagging and it had really not taken things as seriously as they needed to until they get the wake-up call with Micah Shrewsbury leaving from the basketball team. I think things are moving in the right direction now, but does what Michigan did here just underscore the importance of NIL, not just for attracting talent, but keeping your own talent in the building maybe a little bit longer than they otherwise would be?
Yeah, I mean, I think retention is maybe, as important, if not more important than going out and bringing new guys in, recruiting high school athletes and recruiting transfers. Like, to keep your team intact is extremely important, especially when you have, NFL caliber talent. That door is opening and closing every single year. Like, that's just college athletics. And if you do have a successful NIL base, it helps, when there's potentially millions of dollars on the line in the pros, but your, college's NIL collective is like, well, we could get you a couple 100,000, and maybe we could compete for a national championship, and you'd be great in this town. I think that's really important. And I'm not sure exactly what Penn State's NIL situation is right now. I don't think anyone does. You kind of look at the signs and you say, well, they're able to bring in this guy, and that's pretty good. And oh, well, they have this guy and he didn't leave, so obviously they're doing something right. But the numbers, we just don't know enough about. Like, it's just not out there, which is funny and it's weird. So you really kind of just have to guess. But
I will say this, Seth. When I walk into the concourse going to a game this year, they have the state light logger, and they say this contributes to Penn State NIL. They had NIL stuff on the scoreboard this year. They talk a lot more about Happy Valley United than, in terms of recognizing it in the stadium, where you are, where the fans are, where the big donors are. It was up close and present this year in a way that it was not in previous seasons. And so, and I think they're just more organized on a social media level. I think one of the big complaints about basketball was, even during that March Madness run, the NIL collectives were almost saying nothing on Twitter to try to take all of the interest of Penn State being, on their run and turn it into something. They have done that. They tweet about every game now. And so I think those are the types of signs we do have, that Penn State is getting more organized and more professionalized in this space. But that it took it took Micah Shrewsbury leaving, I think, to really shake people. And I think that's maybe where they're falling behind programs like, or at least fell behind programs like Ohio State and Michigan, and now have some ground to make up. Seth, I also want to talk about Michigan's attitude about this whole winning the national championship thing. Mike Persak, who was the Penn State beat reporter for the Post-Gazette, a Michigan alum, he was talking a ton of junk last night and just unapologetic about what Michigan did to get here. With the sign stealing and the NCAA investigations, all of that. Michigan fans do not care. And it on some level, it feels like their donors, their big fans, the people who are most connected to the program, kind of just wanted it more than Penn State's did. And because over here you have Penn State fans kind of clutching their pearls about the facility upgrades from a couple of years ago. You have them clutching their pearls about NIL. We saw Jay Paterno and that crew, kind of not wanting to take the blame for what happened with Micah Shrewsbury, where, guys like Mike Mowdy, Brandon Short, we're putting the focus on how there is a resistant group in Penn State, donor circles in the Penn State fan community that kind of, turns their nose up at a lot of this NIL stuff. Is there a lesson to be learned from Michigan there, and that they did what it took? They said, we're taking the throne by any means necessary, and they went out there and did it. Does Penn State need to want it a little bit more in those upper echelons of movers and shakers who fund the program and make things happen?
Well, I think having the largest alumni association in the country helps. That gives you a head start. And I think when NIL was first kind of started, Penn State was viewed as a school that's like, okay, well, they're in the middle of Pennsylvania, but they have this outreach that no one else has in the entire country. I think it just took so much time to get the ball rolling and for people to realize, like you mentioned, this is college football. This is college athletics. NIL is not going away. It might change a little bit in the next couple of years, but athletes are getting paid. And the way it is right now, you have to rely on public support. You have to rely on your donors and your alumni to donate. They kind of run the ship in a way. And I think with Michigan, and this goes back to my point before, with them being so close, I think that the fans and the alumni saw that. And they're like, okay, we are so close to winning a national championship here. All it takes is for just the small little pieces to come together around this solid block that we have built. And I think it just took a little more donation and a little more attention to get the job done, to go out.
And a little bit of, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, right? I mean, that is to me.
Can't forget about that.
A lot of Penn State fans kind of act like there's going to be a cop that comes in and arrests Jim Harbaugh for his crimes against football and sends him to The Hague or something. That's not how it's going to work. The rules, like this is a lawless sport right now. And either you're going to be a lawless program within that lawless sport, or you're going to, I think, get beat by programs that are willing to do whatever it takes. And I'm not saying Penn State go like full heel here and get their own Connor Stallions and send him out. But in terms of like at least this NIL space, innovate, be one of the leaders in that space where you do have a large alumni base that you can leverage and use in that way and kind of, figure out where the gray areas are and maybe try to exploit them a little bit, better than you have to this point. I think that's kind of the point I want to make. I'm not saying don't start just like, cheating. I'm not saying cheat, but Michigan figured out where the soft edges were and they kind of exploited them. And I think that is an attitude adjustment that Penn State and the donor base maybe needs to make. And to their credit, I think they have with a little bit with NIL and with the progress that's been made since Micah Shrewsbury left. But I think this just underscores how that has to continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to like Penn State's success with honor, just kind of tradition. That is just the way they've operated is we're not going to break the rules. Like, we're not going to cheat. We're not going to do any of that stuff that maybe the SEC programs or Michigan's going to do. And I still think that there are probably some guys on the board and, some big name donors probably still feel that way. Even though this is a sport now that is very different than it was even 5 years ago. And it takes a lot to win a football game, a single football game. It takes, millions of dollars. And to win all 15, it takes a little extra. We saw that for Michigan. I'm not going to comment too much further on that, but it takes a lot. So whether Penn State is willing to maybe go out of their comfort zone and be as bold and aggressive as James Franklin has preached, we'll see. But times are changing, and there might be some regulations so that Penn State might not even be able to kind of make those moves.
Well, and listen, that'd be great. I would love it if college football was a more regulated space where there were rules, where there was enforcement, where everything was on the up and up. Like, that is the ideal scenario, but that's not the world in which we currently live. And in that landscape, that's where I think, to your point, pushing the comfort zone is a good way to put it. Go into those gray areas. Don't break rules, but figure out where you can fudge them to your advantage. And I don't know that Penn State has had that same hunger that I think we saw from Michigan this season that paid off for them handsomely. No matter what happens from here, you can't take the confetti that fell last night from them. Seth, I want to talk a little bit about Washington as well. You and I talked a lot last week about how are these Pac-12 offenses going to change the Big Ten? Our Big Ten defenses, are their rankings a little bit inflated by the fact that they get to play the Indianas and the Michigan States of the world so often, and there's a little bit more offensive firepower in a league like the SEC. So I thought last night was a great test. Michigan's great defense against Washington's great offense that never seems like it's out of a game, and I thought Michigan passed the test with flying colors. What is your read on that game as kind of a preview of what we're going to see next season with USC, Washington, Oregon, and UCLA joining the Big Ten?
Yeah, big game for the Big Ten. That was huge, especially after what we talked about, just being unsure. And I was a little unsure too about Michigan going into this game. I know their defense has been dominant all year, but to be able to completely derail what's likely the most explosive offense in the country, big question mark. And they did it. They did it with the Big Ten model. Like, it's not like I'd say Ohio State kind of skewed to more of an SEC kind of model and how they kind of build their teams. Michigan has always stuck to that same build through the trenches, like I've talked about the whole day. Build through the trenches and do this kind of the Big Ten way with a dominant defense and an offense that just figures out a way to get it done. That's how it was. It was a dominant game, and they won it like a Big Ten team would. Washington's not going to have Michael Penix next year. Caleb Williams is not going to be on USC next year. Bo Nix is not going to be at Oregon. These Pac-12 teams, it's going to be an interesting season. It's going to be fun, and I think that they all have good bases to find success. But to be able to compete with these dominant Big Ten defenses for a whole year now and do it every single week, like, there's no breaks here. There's really no breaks in the competition. I'm interested to kind of see how that works out.
Did you think Penn State could have beaten that team last night at full strength, no opt-outs? You got your corners that you didn't have in the Peach Bowl. Did you look at them and say, hey, man, Penn State scored more points than Washington did on that Michigan defense? Penn State, probably would have played really solid defense against Michael Penix. Did that give you a little bit more hope, I guess, because I think we were in a pretty dark place last week, the way Penn State lost to Ole Miss, how it looked, on the field, even knowing that there were opt-outs. I looked at that game last night, and I said, I think Penn State could have played with that team in a national title game.
Yeah, they probably could have played with that. I mean, and Penn State was around for Michigan. Like, they lost by 9 points. Granted, it felt like a lot more. But I just don't think the offense was good enough this year. To compete with Ohio State or Michigan, or even facing a team like Washington. The receivers, it was a problem. I think Drew just still developing and doing so kind of with a receiving core that just isn't getting the job done. Next year is a new year, new coordinator. So maybe next year's the year. But obviously Michigan's not on the schedule. But that offensive output, that's going to be the most important thing with this Penn State team.
A lot of news on the recruiting front that I want to get into with you, Seth. Literally, like, moments after we finished recording last week, Julian Fleming commits to Penn State, bolsters that receiving core. The former Ohio State product was close to Penn State during the recruiting process. I think Penn State was a pretty close second finally ends up in Happy Valley officially. We've talked about him for a couple of weeks, but Seth, what do you think he adds? Can he be like a true number one? Can he be in the Jahan Dotson mold, or is he just a good receiver at this stage of his career who's better than what Penn State has right now?
Yeah, Julian Fleming. I mean, for a point there, he was probably gonna commit to Penn State, and I think a lot of people thought that this is going to be the Micah Parsons of the offensive side of the ball. This great in-state prospect, top 5 recruit, going to return home, and ends up going to the rival Ohio State, and plays a lot over the past few years, but just doesn't necessarily get the targets because they're given to some of the best receivers we've seen in the country the past decade, like Garrett Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. and a ton of guys there, a ton like Chris Olave, throw him in there, Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's playing behind all these guys, so he has yet to kind of have a role as a number one. Even this season as a veteran, playing behind Harrison and Egbuka, just not getting that chance. And this year he has that chance. This is a guy who's an aggressive receiver. He's able to create space, but he's also a great run blocker. So he adds that to the table as well. And, if I'm Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, I'd be just as happy as Drew Aller with that pickup.
The other big pickup they had was Nolan Ruchi. He used to be, at the time he was recruited, he was the former number 1 recruit in all of Pennsylvania, 5-star guy. 247 has him as more of a 3-star prospect now as a transfer. He's an offensive lineman. He's big, a lot of size, a lot to work with there, Seth. What do you make of that? Because that was another big recruiting loss. But I don't remember a ton of them. I don't dig into the recruiting away. A lot of people do. But I do remember them losing the number 1 in-state prospect to Wisconsin as kind of a big loss for James Franklin. They get him back a couple years later, but they probably have a little bit of work to do to get him back to, the way he was regarded as a high school prospect.
Yeah, you could make the argument that Nolan Ruchi and Julian Fleming were James Franklin's biggest recruiting losses of his Penn State tenure. So it's interesting to see with, this offseason to kind of come full circle. But like with Fleming, Ruchi fills a need on the offensive line. Penn State is losing both of its starting tackles and Olu Fashanu and Caden Wallace next season. And Nolan Ruchi's a guy who is, still in search of a true starting opportunity. He played a lot at Wisconsin and played in games, but he only started a few. And he's a big guy. He's 6'8", I think, right around 300 pounds. I think he's going to work his butt off in training camp and, potentially earn that, starting right tackle spot, given that, Drew Shelton, likely locks up the left tackle spot in place of Olu.
The other big recruiting news this week, A.J. Harris, the former Georgia cornerback, 5-star guy, crystal ball picked to Penn State. That's a pickup they need to finish right, Seth. I mean, just given what we saw in the Peach Bowl against a good Ole Miss passing attack, the guys Penn State had were not good enough. And granted, they weren't in those roles all year. They're going to have a full offseason in the program. They're not going to be playing Ole Miss every week in Big Ten play. I think that, what Penn State has, it would have looked a lot better through much of the Big Ten schedule. But, again, like we talked about last week, it's not just about getting to the college football playoff next year. It's about having a chance to win. I think this is a guy you have to go get if you're going to have a chance to win games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's any question Penn State needs to add another corner, if not 2. It was embarrassing, in the Peach Bowl. Like Cam Miller, I understand is developing. He's young, but he got beat, by Trey Harris, who's a really good Ole Miss receiver, and the tight ends as well. Ole Miss tight end had like 130 receiving yards. I think so did Trey Harris. It was just, it was a disaster in the secondary, which was, kind of a unit that was completely locked up the whole year. With Dixon and Kalen King and Daquan Hardy in the nickel, it worked really well. So they need to kind of revamp that whole room now with King and Dixon out and same with Hardy. I think personally, Cam Miller is either better as an in-the-box corner, similar to what Johnny Dixon did, or they just move him to nickel completely. And you fill those 2, normal corner positions, elsewhere. But A.J. Harris is a guy who, 5-star, like you mentioned. He's young and developing as well. He was only a freshman at Georgia, but he has a ton of talent, and there's no doubt about it. He is one of the top transfer recruits in the country right now. And behind them, it's the freshmen. It's Zion Tracy and Elliott Washington, who did struggle in the Peach Bowl. Granted, they're young too, but they're going to need some help. But I think it does say something, though, Adam, that Tracy and Washington were two of the 4 or 5 burnt red shirts they had this year, and they were 2 corners. So that should say something. Coaches must see something, but I think they still need some help in that secondary.
Yeah, and I think if you're Penn State, you hope that the youth you have now and the inexperience you have now translates to some more meaningful results and kind of shoring up that secondary in the years to come. And listen, I mean, it's not as if we haven't seen young guys perform in this defense. Kalen King, I think is the number one guy who came in as a freshman and contributed and found a niche. And I think he's the template for a lot of these guys. We'll see if Penn State can get similar results out of some of these young guys. Seth, I'll get you out of here on this. Nice win for the basketball team. The most important game, everyone was joking on Twitter, the most important Michigan game of the week. Penn State beats Michigan at the Palestra. Historic venue. Always great to get the program in front of those Philadelphia fans who I think there's interest out there in the program. They fill up the Palestra every single time to see this team. It's just a question of, can you get that game on the schedule every year? I thought it was a nice boost. They're now 2-2 in the Big Ten. I think March Madness is still a pretty far cry, but they look like they could win 7 or 8 games right now, Seth.
Yeah, it's like it changes every time they play because it's like 31-point loss to Michigan State. It's like, oh, well, this team is awful. One of the worst teams we've seen. And then they beat Michigan. You're like, oh, well, they're back now. They're, the 14-point comeback. It's kind of similar to what we saw against Ohio State. It was an 18-point comeback. This one was just so much cooler because it was just at the Palestra, which if you haven't been is just it's a must watch. Like it is a museum of college basketball. Built in 1927, the floor squeaks are iconic. That it's so loud, despite it being only about 8,000 people in there. Everyone just kind of crammed together. It was just a spectacle. It was really special to be there and also do it with Phil Martelli, longtime St. Joe's coach, serving as the honorary head coach for Michigan. In his return to the Palestra. That was special. And, him coaching against Jimmy Martelli, his son, who was a Penn State assistant. There were a lot of storylines, and it was just kind of fun to be there for that.
One of my favorite Penn State trivia answers is that the Cathedral Learning at Pitt, Rec Hall at Penn State, and the Palestra in Philadelphia at Penn were all designed by the same architect. Right. They all have that connective tissue. I think that's a fun little fact that I don't think a lot of people know, but those 3 iconic buildings all came from one guy.
Yeah, I believe his name was Charles Clauder, great architect. And it's funny with Rec Hall too, and this is something I think a lot of people are a little pissed off about. Every time Penn State plays in the Palestra, is like Penn State literally has the model of Rec Hall in its backyard in Rec Hall, and it's just they just don't use it. It's they're playing once this year in February, which should be awesome. But if you love the Palestra so much, like, can't they just play the games against Lemoyne or against Rider that aren't going to, pack the BJC? Can't they play those in Rec Hall? Like, I don't understand that. Like, I understand the BJC is great for things like concerts and, you get Drake in there and Travis Scott. But, like, for a small Penn State non-conference basketball game, like, what would it take to just put more of those games in Rec Hall? Because it really is special, and I think it's just better fan experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm glad they're getting back to that return to rec thing, and I know that the big logistical issue is you got to buy the court, right, and you got to set up a different court on top of the existing surface. But hey, listen, we're talking about Beaver Stadium renovations. Maybe you could do some renovations to Rec Hall to make it usable, as a space for students, as a space for the wrestling and the volleyball programs, but also have it available without having to lay out a brand new court on top of the existing surface every time you want to play a basketball game there. It should just be as simple as saying, hey, we're going to play a couple games here. We're going to do exactly what you said against these smaller colleges. non-conference games, especially over the holidays, Seth, when there's no students there either. There's no one. It's just the townies. It would be cool, a nice draw if you were playing a couple more games in Rec Hall. It doesn't have to be the whole schedule. But listen, I mean, the wrestling program made the decision to leave the BJC more or less, right? I mean, they were doing a lot of their duels in the Bryce Jordan Center, and Cale Sanderson said, no, we like the intimacy of Rec Hall. We're going to do most of our stuff here, and you're going to have the one duel a season in the BJC, to get a big crowd. And I think they found the right balance. I think that there's a balance that the basketball program can find too. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking too. Is like, okay, well, if they're playing the Indianas or the Michigans or the Ohio States of the world, like, okay, you put those in the BJC if you're expecting a big crowd. But like, the BJC does not look good when they're playing a bad non-conference team and no one is there, especially over the holiday. It just doesn't. It's terrible. Like, honestly, it's terrible. And just seeing this past weekend at the Palestra, it was amazing. Like, I want more of that, and Penn State should too. Pat Kraft was there; he saw it. Like, maybe he's taking notes. Maybe if he's listening to this, he's taking some more notes. But you're right. Like, add that to the renovations. Like, make that a plan. I think it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Seth, thanks for joining me this week. Like we said, we're going to do this every week. We have things to talk about. We had a lot to talk about this week. We got through our 30 minutes. So Seth, have a lovely week. We will be back here again, see how the recruiting news goes, see how the fallout from the national championship goes. And I'm excited for the offseason, Seth. I think we're going to have some fun topics.
Yeah, as am I. Thanks, Adam.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.